Hey everyone, this is Brown at Eye of Brown, and today we are going to be talking about Third Eye by Rick R. Reed. So, Third Eye was written in 2020, and it was the third book of Rick R. Reed's that I've had the chance to read. See what I did there? But the first book of his I ever checked out was called Obsessed, which was a horror novel that came out in the early 90s, and it was a part of the Abyss horror line that Dell Publishing had, back in the early 90s. And as far as serial killer horror novels go, it was a good one. And the next book of his I read was called Dead End Street, which was actually a young adult horror novel, but was also a very good book. And I would actually recommend that one if you've never read anything by him, because it serves as a good introduction to his writing style. And even though it's geared towards a younger audience, it's written well enough to where even as an adult you can appreciate it. And it actually gets very spooky towards the climax. It's one of those things where it's like, it gets spookier as things go on, or as a story goes on, as it were. So both of those books were, things that kind of made me a fan of his. And he actually has a large body of work, and I was kind of weary of it because the majority of it focused on gay adult fiction. And meaning no disrespect to anyone, that's just kind of a genre that I tend to avoid. It's just kind of not my thing. But that being said, though, I kind of got to thinking, and I was just like, Rick R. Reed's a very good writer, and it's not fair to steer clear of one's work just because they have gay characters as the focus for the majority of their work. And so I looked around and I found some plot synopses that sounded interesting. And Third Eye in particular sounded like it'd be, something that would be up my alley, so to speak, or my cup of tea, as it were. And so I got off Amazon, and Third Eye was a good one. And so the story centers on the character of Casey D'Amico, who is a single father and a gay man living in the small town of Fawcettville, which was on the Ohio River within this book. And it's a conservative small town, so he's gotten his share of flack for being a gay man who somehow managed to have a kid with a woman, and that was a story in and of itself. But anyway, the mother's out of the picture. She has kind of ditched him and his young son Luke at some point a long time ago, and so he's been raising his son ever since. And he dearly loves his son. And his parents, Luke's grandparents, constantly dote on Luke, but they're constantly also in disapproval of Casey, because of his quote unquote lifestyle. And he actually ends up having a rather fateful accident occur one day when a thunderstorm is coming into town. And his son Luke was out playing, and as the storm's getting more and more dangerous and Luke hasn't come back yet, Casey's going out into the woods trying to find his son. And as it happens, a bolt of lightning strikes a tree branch that happens to be right above Casey's head, and it lands on him to a point where he's in a coma for a day, and he comes to in the hospital. And all things considered, he's actually very lucky. I mean, he got off easy, so to speak. I mean, he's going to have to wear bandages and take it easy for a time, which, I mean, to be sure, can be stressful considering his economic situation. He's a waiter, and so he doesn't really have a lot in the way of PTO, as it were. But something else happens due to this accident. He actually starts to have psychic visions. Like, he can actually pick up on certain things from people just by, say, touching them or interacting with them. And to the point where he starts to get some of their thoughts and some of their secrets. And so and this is wild enough. But the main thing, though, is he actually starts to have visions of a teenage girl who, it turns out, has gone missing. And unfortunately, these visions, they kind of start to drive him insane. or at least it seems like they're driving him insane, because he's, trying to cope with, on one hand, being able to pick up on things from, people just by casual contact. But on the other hand, though, these, dreams slash, waking dreams, these visions of the teenage girl, keep, coming into, his life, to a point where, I mean, he's finding out stuff about her. Like, he's getting visions of what she saw, before she died. And yes, he does find out that she, in fact, had been murdered. And so he takes it upon himself to try and, find her, or at the very least, help bring closure to her parents. But unfortunately, though, because of how crazy his story sounds, no one wants to believe him, even though he's clearly seen stuff, that could lead them in the direction of either her body or her killers. And even the police detective who hears him out, a woman named J.T. Simmons, and the only female police detective on the Fosterville police force, she's, understandably skeptical of what he has to say, and she's thinking that he's kind of a, he's clearly someone who's, been under some stress, but, she's, very reluctant to, believe him in his stories about psychic visions. But as things continue to, make themselves known, in these visions, he's actually able to help the mother of this teenage girl, find, closure, in a sense that he's able to lead her to the body, which is a very, very emotionally nerve-wracking passage in of itself with, in this novel. And by doing so, unfortunately, like, people's, start to, hone in on him, like they're wanting to know, okay, how did you know this, and what have you. But on the other hand, though, he does form a friendship with a man named, let's see, what was his name? Oh yeah, sorry. Dave Newton, who is a reporter on the Fosterville newspaper. And, he is, in the book, he's described as kind of a British Sam Elliott. But he himself is also gay. And so the two of them actually, become friends because of, their commonality, but also, because of Casey's, psychic ability, he's able to, form a connection with Dave, and basically he understands that Dave, has his own, baggage and his own, tragic story as well. But at the same time, Dave is someone who's genuinely trying to, while he's trying to do his job, he's also wanting to help out the family of the missing and now deceased girl. And unfortunately, though, this isn't the only girl who's been kidnapped and murdered, and she's not the only girl that Casey has visions of. And Dave, as he becomes closer with Casey, he actually believes Casey, because in his career as a reporter, he's heard some strange stories, and he's been able to do research on psychic phenomena. And while he's not an expert on the matter, he's seen enough, to where he's like, I don't doubt, what you're experiencing. And so, Casey has an ally, and gradually something more with the person of Dave Newton. And unfortunately, though, while people are starting to follow his advice as far as, where to find the bodies and what have you, as well as, what to look for, other people have started to hone in on Casey, namely the killers of these women, or I should say, of these young girls. And and unfortunately for Casey, the main person in this group is a young man named Ian, who is a sort of supernaturally obsessed serial killer. Like, he styles himself, in the, quote unquote wisdom of people like Aleister Crowley and Anton Levy. And so, he feels like, he's, a son of the beast or something like that. And he has an accomplice in the form of a young girl named Myra, who he actually sort of coerced into joining him, like through seduction. And since he was older than her, he was in his 20s and she's a teenage girl, she's enticed by his way of living and his sort of dark knowledge. And so she runs away from home and becomes his accomplice. But unfortunately, Ian and Myra are keeping track with the news in Fawcettville, and as news comes out that Casey is the one who pointed authorities into the right direction in finding the bodies, they're like, okay, somehow this guy knows what we've done. Who's to say that he won't find out, or he doesn't already know who we are. And so they set their sights on Casey and his son Luke. And so this was very much a page turner of a novel, because while there is definitely a supernatural element in the story, what with the psychic visions, it's not a straight up horror novel, but it's a very effective murder mystery / thriller that has elements of horror. And there's definitely more than a touch of Stephen King's The Dead Zone within this novel, which is also a very good novel and a very good movie adaptation as well. So check them both out if you can. But anyway, so while there is a similarity to Stephen King's work in this novel, it definitely manages to stand out on its own, what with the protagonist as well as the setting and the characters within the story. Like, this manages to be its own thing. And there were moments where, like, on one hand, I found myself getting lost in the details that Rick R. Reed managed to turn out in this story, like when he's describing the geography and the history of the town of Fawcettville, and you really feel like you're getting to know what it's like to live in this town, both in a good way and a bad way, because it's like you're drawn in by a small town charm, but at the same time, because you're seeing a lot of it from the perspective of characters who are, say, isolated, because of their sexuality, you start to see a small town glamour in a not so positive light, unfortunately. But nonetheless, though, you really do feel like you're in this setting. And it turns out that Rick R. Reed actually based Fawcettville on his old hometown of East Liverpool, Ohio. And I think maybe, that's why, the descriptions of, the setting were so effective, at least in my opinion, as far as, getting a feel for the environment. And you really do feel like you're in a small town that, while it's fictional, it feels real. But also, I really got to care about the characters in this story. Namely, the characters of Casey and his son Luke, because, it's one of those things where, you get to know them both as characters, and you get to really, identify with Casey, because on one hand, he's just a guy trying to, make it in the world and in a small town, and, it's one of those, situations where it's all he's known his whole life, and he really has no desire to get out of it, even though he has his struggles within the small town because of his sexuality. But at the same time, it's, what he knows. It's something that, he's familiar with. And plus, he doesn't want to just uproot his son Luke from what he's known his whole life as well. And so he also, as a father, is very protective and nurturing towards his son. And once he finds out that the killers are interested in trying to get him, he also knows that they could potentially get his son Luke, because they've specialized in killing young people. albeit mostly female victims, as far as and the media knows. But at the same time, he knows that they're not above, say doing something to his son, and so you really identify with his urge to protect his son and keep an eye out for him. But also, I liked how as he and the character of Dave, the reporter, get to know each other. You really got to see a sort of bond form between the two. And while, yes, I mean, it's definitely within the area of gay romance, it's not something that's raunchy. Like, it feels three-dimensional. Like, it feels real. Like, two people with some, tragic backstories, or at the very least, people who have seen some shit in life, are forming a connection with each other. And while there's definitely an attraction, it's something that it feels like gradual, like they're getting to know each other. And so by the time something of a romantic nature does happen, it actually feels earned. And so I very much liked both the characters of Casey and Dave. And, plus the idea of a British Sam Elliott is, kind of, worthy of a chuckle in and of itself. But, in all fairness, Dave Newton's a very well-rounded character. And you're kind of wondering, well, what's a British guy doing in a small town, Ohio area? And there is actually a pretty good story behind that, but I'll have to let you read the, book in order to find it. But nonetheless, it's something to where, once you find out how he got to Fawcettville and how and why he stayed there all these years, you're kind of like, yeah, I could understand how that could happen. So you definitely come to identify and relate with the characters of Casey and Dave. And also I appreciate that Dave while he is a reporter who's wanting to do his job, he has a genuine interest in helping people. In this case, like, he's genuinely wanting to help Casey come to terms with his new ability, as well as his emotional baggage as well. Because, I mean, as a fellow gay man, he can definitely relate with him. And also, I liked how he's a reporter with a conscience, in the sense that while he is wanting to do his job and get the scoop, so to speak, he's not wanting to do it at the cost of another family's misery. Like, he's genuinely wanting to help them find closure with their missing daughter. Is she dead, is she alive, and so on and so forth. At the least, he's wanting to help them get closure with that situation, because even though he himself doesn't have any children, he understands the trauma that comes with losing a loved one. And so so I really liked both the characters of Casey and Dave. They were very three-dimensional characters, very, very well written, very believable. And also I liked the character of J.T. Simmons, who is the aforementioned Fawcettville police detective. And she has an interesting backstory as well. And she was actually someone who was a lesbian, but because the relationship she had was so personal and strong, and unfortunately her partner ended up dying of cancer a long time ago. She's never felt any sort of urge to find another partner, and she's just become quote-unquote married to the job. But she takes her job very seriously, and she's very good at what she does. And I do like the fact that she was someone that, I mean, felt believable, in the sense that like, she's initially dismissive of Casey's admissions of psychic visions, but at the same time she's not dismissive of him as a person, though. Like, she understands his feelings as a father, and as someone who has a child of his own, and she understands that he does care about these missing teenage girls. But she also is kind of thinking that maybe because of the accident that he had with the branch hitting his head, that he might have some sort of mental trauma from that as well. So she's dismissive initially of his psychic visions, but she's not dismissive of him, if that makes sense. And I like that. Of course, she actually does start to believe that there's something to his visions. Once he and the mother of one of the teenage girls are able to point the police in the direction of where the body is, because the two of them found it. And so when that happens, it's one of those things where she's forced to admit that there might be something else at work here, but at the same time, because she's a police officer, she can't just wholly subscribe to the point of view of the supernatural. Like, she has to have some sort of neutrality, as it were. And so so she was another well-written character. But as far as, say, like the supernatural element goes, this was something that I felt like it's something that could have been a letdown, because there's not a lot in the way of exploration as to the effects of the supernatural. But at the same time, there's just enough to where it's like, okay, there is some sort of supernatural phenomena at work here. I mean, Casey getting hit in the head did somehow result in him being able to have these psychic abilities, and so whenever something of a horrific nature happens, from his perspective, like when he's at home one night and he's reluctant to go to sleep, because every time he does, he starts to see stuff that the missing teenage girls saw, and he knows that it's going to lead to their deaths, which, I mean, that's what in fact did happen, but because he's seeing it all, he doesn't want to see any more of the trauma, because he's got enough going on as it is. But nonetheless, like, there's a point where one night he wakes up, and in the living room, one of the teenage girls sort of materializes there, and basically just silently asks for his help. But she also makes him watch the TV, which initially is just a bunch of static, but then he starts to see the landscape of where her body's buried, and so basically she's asking him, please help me, find help my mama find my body, and what have you. And so it's definitely one of those things where, while you don't get a straight up explanation as to like you that the accident of the lightning striking the tree branch and the branch hitting him in the head, that's what gave him these abilities, but you don't know why. Like, was he picked by fate, or was there something more at work? It doesn't answer that question, but it just kind of throws him and you, the reader, into the situation of suddenly having these abilities and trying to come to terms with that. And initially, Casey has a very hard time of doing so, but then he comes to feel that hey, if I have an ability that is giving me the opportunity to help someone out, I need to use this, regardless of how crazy I might sound to those around me. And so Casey, much like Johnny Smith from the Dead Zone, sort of becomes a reluctant hero, but he himself is not. He doesn't see himself as a hero. But from the reader's perspective, though, because he's going out of his way to try and help someone, with his abilities, he's definitely in the well-traveled path of, say, the reluctant hero. And I have to say, the passage where he and the mother of one of the missing girls, it's at night, they're in the woods, and he's able to, guide her to where the body is, because she's at the point where, she's desperate, enough to where she's willing to, take a chance on, anyone having some sort of answers as to where her little girl is. And so, Casey and her, they go out into the woods at night, and they're and once Casey's pointing out where the body is because of these visions, she's seeing Casey reacting to being hit with these visions, and so she knows that there's something going on here. But once the two of them start digging at the spot, oh my God, there was just one of those emotionally nerve-wracking moments where Casey's getting hit with what the girl's final moments were, which, I mean, that's horrific enough. And the mom, she's basically begging Casey to tell her what happened, and then at the same time they're both digging, and then they find the body, and oh my God, it was just one of those very human moments within say a work of art. Even though this isn't a straight up horror novel, it was a very effective moment of horror because of the very human moment that is on hand here, because you have the mother of the missing and now deceased girl, and you have Casey here, who did not want these visions but is nonetheless being forced to experience what this little girl went through, and he's doing his damnedest to try and help the mother of the girl. And it's just, once he actually makes physical contact with the body, though, he just breaks down, and so does the mom once she finds the remains of her little girl too. And it's just it from a human standpoint, it was a very believable and tragic moment. And I guess in terms of say nerve-wracking and emotionally devastating moments I've read within a work of horror fiction, or at least a thriller, it ranked up there for me. But yes, as far as the villains go in this book, the character of Ian is just straight up evil. He just, like, there's a little bit of back and forth, like, okay, is there something supernatural going on with his character, or is he just someone who fell under the sway of the writings of supernatural occultists, and came to think that he himself was the next big thing or something like that, or is there something more demonic at work guiding his actions? Now, I like that there was some ambiguity in that regard. Like, you don't get a straight up answer with that, but it's just enough to where it's like, regardless of whether it's something supernatural with Ian or if it's just straight up human evil, it's terrifying regardless, because of how easily he's able to seduce and abduct these young girls and do the unspeakable to them. And those are some of the most nerve-wracking moments within this book, because as a human being, anyone who has any sort of familiarity with trying to keep their children safe, or keep a child safe from the darkness of the world at large, the moments when Ian is able to entice these girls away from their families and into his arms and worse, I mean, are some of the most nerve-wracking moments in the book, because of how tragically relatable these moments are. Because who knows how many people in the world, how many kids in the world have basically been taken from their homes by men such as these. And also the character of Myra, his lover and accomplice, was someone that I found very intriguing, because while she is a villain in this book, and she's also an accomplice at Ian's, there is something of a tragic element to her character, because she starts to sort of flashback a few times to who she used to be before Ian came into her life. And as their murderous activities are escalating, she starts to actually feel some level of guilt and remorse, to the point where when they're setting their sights on Casey and his son Luke, she's basically at a point where she's trying to find some way to get Ian to back off. Like, okay, if we're going after Casey, it's one thing, but we do not need to kill the kid. We don't need to do anything to the kid. But, Ian, being obsessed with, his dark messianic, delusions, or are they delusions? It's one of those things where it's like she's in an abusive relationship to the point where she's afraid of rebelling against Ian. And so that actually was something that felt very believable as well, because it's one of those things where it's like you have, toxic relationships that, you see in day-to-day life, but then this is an instance where the toxic relationship, is, centered on, two killers, and, one of them being more in control of the other. And so very terrifying and yet believable villains in this book. And I do appreciate that, with at least with the character of Myra, they had someone who, while she was a part of, the evil activities, she's actually starting to, I guess you could say, regain some measure of humanity, albeit in a very limited way. And Ian, though, is just straight up evil. And so I did like how, while the supernatural elements of the story had a lot of ambiguity to them, in the sense that you don't know exactly, why they're happening with the character of Casey, or you don't know for sure if there's something supernatural going on with Ian. The fact that they're there is enough, and just like I said, it's like you're with Casey being dropped into the war zone, not knowing what's going on, and having to adapt rather quickly to the situation. And so Rick R. Reed did a very good job of doing that, with the character Casey, and in turn the reader as well. But also I really do appreciate, how believable he made, the connections, with these characters, how strong that the connections were. And, like I said, when, the characters of Casey and Dave, when they become more than friends, it feels believable. And so I'm going to go ahead and give Third Eye 5 out of 5 stars. This was an excellent novel. Not a straight up horror novel, but it's definitely sort of like a murder mystery thriller with some, horror elements in there. But this was a page turner, and it's something that I'm glad I took a chance on. And Rick R. Reed's definitely, a writer now that I know to keep an eye out for, as far as, any other work that he does. Do I see myself reading, gay, romance by the fireplace with a glass of Chardonnay anytime soon? Probably not. But at the same time, though, I do know that, if there's a book by Rick R. Reed that comes out that is along these lines, or just, by him in general, it's a good bet it's going to be a good book. And so I very much enjoyed this book. I'm glad that, like I said, I took a chance with it, and it definitely cemented, Rick R. Reed as, a, good writer in my eyes. And so I'm definitely wanting to, check out more of his stuff, and I'll probably be doing so in the future. So thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. And you got any questions, comments, please drop a line and let me know. You got any feedback, I'd love to hear it. And you like what you see here, please feel free to like and subscribe. So y'all have a good day. Take care. Bye.